New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. My guest is Matthew Segall, who is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is author of Crossing the Threshold, Etheric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead, as well as Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology. Matthew lives in Northern California, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Matt. It is a pleasure to be with you today.
Lovely to join you today, Jeff.
We'll be talking about the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. I'm especially interested in this conversation because I know Whitehead was a big influence on my mentor, Arthur M. Young, who wrote a book of process philosophy himself, The Reflexive Universe. And I have to admit, until I began reading your material, I couldn't say that I really understood Whitehead. He was something of an enigma to me, so I very much appreciate the fact that you've made his thinking clear to me, at least clearer. And I suppose a good place to start with Whitehead is to place him historically. He was, for example, born back in the 19th century.
That's right, 1861, I believe, and born on the what's called the Isle of Thanet in England, and ended up at Cambridge after a high school career as a rugby player. He was a star rugby player, and so quite an athlete before he became a pretty accomplished mathematician at Cambridge. He was there for 25 years. Around the turn of the century, Bertrand Russell showed up at Cambridge as a student of his, but very quickly became a colleague. Most people who are familiar with Whitehead know about the Principia Mathematica that he and Russell co-authored in the first decade of the 20th century. That project is usually considered to be both a tremendous success and a tremendous failure. They didn't end up being able to formally ground mathematics in logic. They ran into paradoxes, and this really upset Russell. But Whitehead was liberated from that, and so he began a second career as a philosopher, and was conversant with Albert Einstein and quantum theory as that was beginning to develop in the first few decades of the 20th century. And then in 1924, he was invited by Harvard University to come over to America and taught there for about 15 years, and wrote all of the books that I at least know and love, including Process and Reality. And, he's kind of been in cold storage for the better part of a century. He was very influential in his time and was kept in print by some theologians who really appreciated his novel understanding of God and the relationship between God and the world. But it's only more recently that philosophers and scientists are rediscovering his work. And, there are various reasons for that I'm sure we can get into, but that's the basic trajectory.
I know in your writing, you sometimes contrast and compare Whitehead with a very prominent and also, I think, largely forgotten philosopher of his era, F.H. Bradley, who was a British idealist.
Yeah, Francis Herbert Bradley was quite popular in the 19th century. And actually, Bertrand Russell, even Ludwig Wittgenstein and G.E. Moore, these huge names who really helped to inaugurate analytic philosophy in resistance to British idealism, they all started out when they were students quite taken by Bradley's view. He's a beautiful writer and a compelling thinker, and Whitehead agreed that Bradley's thought needed to be taken seriously. And I think of Whitehead's mature process philosophy as an attempt to preserve what is of value in this idealistic point of view, to integrate these new analytic methods, logical methods, and 20th century science, and to articulate what ends up not being an idealism anymore, but what Whitehead calls an organic realism, where mind has a place in nature, but nature isn't reducible to mind or to some absolute mind, let's say. And so, Whitehead is hard to categorize in the sense that he's always trying to find a third mediating position between these extremes. Obviously, he was no slouch when it comes to the methods of logical analysis, but he didn't think that logic could finally get to the bottom of things. He really did believe that aesthetics and imagination and poetry gave us some purchase on the ultimate nature of things that logic could not penetrate to, right? And so, whereas the analytic philosophers would think of poetry and art and whatnot as nice window dressing and maybe make our lives more enjoyable, none of that's relevant for understanding the nature of reality. Whitehead disagrees with that, right? And so he's really seeking some integration of the best of what analysis can give us with a deep appreciation for the aesthetic basis of reality and the poetic basis of mind, you could say. So he's really an integrative thinker.
And he got to that point through a lot of hard work. I mean, the whole project of the Principia Mathematica was to reduce all of mathematics to a logical system. And I gather that when it became clear to both Bertrand Russell and Whitehead that was an impossibility because of all of the paradoxes involved, that Whitehead came to the conclusion that reality itself cannot be reduced to a logical system.
Right, that's right. Yeah, I mean, they spent hundreds of pages trying to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. And to prove that logically, in other words, so that there wouldn't be any need for intuitive leaps. And there's so much that we take for granted in our thinking processes where our capacity to just instinctually know, what follows in this chain of reasoning. We don't explicitly articulate all the steps of our reasoning. And they really wanted to be able to not take a single leap that couldn't be logically justified, right? They wanted to arrive at the clear, distinct premises that would allow us to know that 1 + 1 = 2, and they couldn't do it. And so Whitehead ends up having to accept that there's an ineradicably intuitive dimension, even to logic and mathematics. Whereas I think, as I said, Russell was quite troubled by this. He really, really wanted, and in some sense needed, reality to be resolvable in logical terms. And Whitehead was freed from that search, and it only became apparent decades later with Gödel's incompleteness theorems, what the true nature of the paradoxes they were running into were. And so, what Whitehead ends up saying in 1938, decades later after Gödel, is in his book Modes of Thought, which might be the most approachable book he wrote for those who are interested in diving into his thought for the first time. He says that logic is a subset of aesthetics, that logical order is actually an expression of a deeper aesthetic order, right? This from one of the premier logicians of the 20th century. And so that gives us a lot to think about there.
Indeed, it does. And now you mentioned Wittgenstein earlier, who was also, I guess, associated with the logical positivist movement, which again was a very rigorous movement and associated, I think, with analytical philosophy and the attempt to get rid of all the fluffy stuff in philosophy, emotions, for example. But I gather that towards the end of his career, Wittgenstein himself turned against that view.
Yeah, and probably was misunderstood by the logical positivists in the beginning when he publishes the Tractatus, Logico-Philosophicus Tractatus, I think is the title. I might be confusing the order of those words, but Wittgenstein argues that language is best thought of from the logician's point of view as an attempt to create a kind of picture of the world, and that there are some things, including all of ethics, for example, but also religious experience and whatnot, that we can't speak about in a clear, logical way because it doesn't have an empirical basis. And the positivists, I think, understood Wittgenstein to be saying, therefore, all of that stuff that's beyond the empirical world is non-existent or unimportant. And that's the exact opposite of what Wittgenstein was saying. He was really trying to, I would say, protect sort of the sacredness of the ethical and the mystical from logical capture, right? But the positivists took this in a different way. Wittgenstein was very upset by that. He was constantly being misunderstood. He, would enter into dialogue with Russell and be so frustrated that Russell just wasn't getting it. This, one of the smartest men in the world, Wittgenstein felt wasn't smart enough for him. And actually, there's some letters that Whitehead writes to friends because he was familiar with Wittgenstein, had met him on several occasions, and really couldn't stand him. He was a pretty abrasive, difficult person to be around. Whitehead was involved politically in the women's suffrage movements and early feminist movements, and Wittgenstein's notorious for not allowing women into his classroom, and on occasion when a woman would try to sit in to one of his lectures, he would stand there in silence and wait for them to get the picture that he wanted them to leave, right? So Whitehead did not like him. He said of Wittgenstein in a letter that he's a bright boy, nothing more. And I think he even used the phrase insufferable. So, Wittgenstein's a genius, but Whitehead was not actually that impressed with him as a person. And of course, the later Wittgenstein articulates very different views about the nature of language as a form of life, and moved very far from his early, more analytic views of it. So he's a complicated figure. I don't mean to sound dismissive, but I wanted to give a sense for how Whitehead related to him.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you this question, Matt. Given the differences between Wittgenstein and Russell, it strikes me from what I'm gleaning about Whitehead's philosophy from you that he probably noticed that these two personalities were looking at similar logical problems and seeing them very differently, and that may have been an influence on his organismic philosophy, the idea that the organism itself becomes central?
Whitehead's always thinking holistically and thinking about the way in which, we can't do without these more rationalistic methodologies, including logic and mathematics, but that needs to be integrated with a more experientially grounded approach to understanding reality. And so, Whitehead's speculative method ends up articulating 4 criteria. And there are the rational criteria and the empirical criteria for, how we are to judge the adequacy of a metaphysical scheme, right? And so he wants it to be logically consistent. He wants it to be logically coherent. But he also wants it to be empirically applicable and adequate, so that there is no experience that we might have that wouldn't find its place in the scheme of thought that he has produced. And that includes everything from the parapsychological, anything that there's good evidence for. Whitehead would say, well, our cosmology should have a place for that. We need to make sense of it. We can't ignore evidence because it doesn't fit into the tidy categories of our system, right? And so he approaches systematic philosophies that have been articulated in the past, and he often finds places where these great philosophers, whether it's Hume or Kant or Locke or Spinoza, where they make some statement, some observation about the nature of reality that's actually contrary to or falls outside the purview of their otherwise tight logical system. He says, that's the key insight. And he picks up all these insights from the history of philosophy and creates a more integrative picture where they can all find a place, right? So nobody can read Process in Reality and think that there isn't some heavy logical lifting going on there, and that there isn't a deep appreciation for mathematical physics and the complexities of relativity theory and quantum theory. But there's also a place for religious experience and a place for the sorts of deep emotions and values that the arts convey to us, and common sense experience, and our practical lives, and our emotions and our visceral feelings. Like all of this, Whitehead wants to say, is giving us a window on reality.
And I gather that while Whitehead was very sympathetic to Bradley and the philosophy of idealism, he thought that the logical rigor of the idealist philosophers ignored all of these facets that began to intrigue him so much.
Someone like the German idealist Hegel would be more guilty of that in Whitehead's eyes than Bradley, because while Bradley is an idealist and is often described as a Hegelian, there's a way in which the sort of British empiricist tradition and this emphasis on feeling and experience really comes through in Bradley's work. And so it's not, I mean, Bradley was a great logician and wrote quite a deal about logic, but he has a way of understanding the conceptual side of life that's always embedded in like the concrete psychology of a person, and our emotional life and our encounter with beauty in the natural world. And so I wouldn't say Bradley is as guilty of that kind of overly logical point of view. Bradley is mixing this wonderful British empiricist tradition with the German idealist tradition and finding a happy medium there. And similarly, while, Whitehead is taking so much from Bradley, he's trying to find an even happier medium that doesn't rush to reduce our individual experience to an absolute mind, as if there's some absolute spirit behind the scenes that we can't directly experience, but that as a metaphysician we'd have to say is more real than what we do directly experience. Whitehead is constantly on the lookout for any philosophy which would resort to heroic feats of explaining away, would be his phrase, or that would refer to mere appearance, right? That our individual experience is mere appearance, and what's truly real is this one absolute mind. Whitehead's not happy with that. If it appears, it's real for Whitehead. So he really wants to do justice to our aesthetic experience and not reduce down to material particles, which is the usual form of reductionism that we hear about, or reduce up to some ultimate whole that would make our individual experience somehow illusory.
I gather that Whitehead is sometimes thought of as having elaborated William James' notion of radical empiricism.
Absolutely, yeah. James's psychology is the basis upon which Whitehead elaborates his cosmology. James wasn't so much a systematic thinker, but he's full of these rich descriptions and thick descriptions of human experience. in the stream of thought, the stream of consciousness. And Whitehead takes James's account of our psychological experience and generalizes it to really systematize this idea that James suggests in some of his later work about a realm of pure experience before the split into mind and matter, or subject and object. And Whitehead systematizes that so that you can get a sort of rigorous philosophy of science out of that. You can still make precise measurements of the external world and understand the models that physics is able to come up with in the context of a world of pure experience. Whereas James is more, he's at the level of suggestion, really rich, enticing suggestions, but Whitehead wants to cash that out. And so, his cosmology is an expansion and a systematization of James's psychology.
I struggle with James myself as well, but I gather the notion of radical empiricism means that if somebody experiences something, anything, science cannot justifiably ignore that. That has to be considered data.
That's right. And so in Whitehead's philosophy of science, he really challenges this view that originates with Galileo, and then Locke has his version of it, of a split, or what Whitehead calls a bifurcation of nature, where you have the primary characteristics, which are all the things that can be measured and quantified, mass, the dimensionality, and the things that physics thinks is real. And then you have the secondary characteristics, which are all of our perceptions and our emotions and values, all the stuff added by the subject. And Galileo had this methodological split to make physics possible. You have to ignore all of the subjective stuff to simplify the picture so that physics can make some progress. And it did make tremendous progress for centuries using this method. But then the problem starts when Descartes turns a method into a metaphysics or a dualistic substance ontology. So these two characteristics that Galileo notes become two separate substances, and never the two shall meet, or at least Descartes couldn't figure out how they met, how mind and matter might communicate with each other. And so Whitehead rethinks this picture and says, we can't pick and choose what's in nature and what's in the mind. He says, everything we perceive is in nature, whether that's the precise measurements made by the detectors that physicists are building, or it's the red hue of a beautiful sunset. Our subjective experience is part of nature, right? So he wants to bring experience back into nature and re-articulate a philosophy of science that would avoid this bifurcation, right? And so like James's radical empiricism, we have to really be inclusive in our picture of what direct experience reveals to us about the world, and not pick and choose and making these arbitrary distinctions that, this is real because I can quantify it, and this is not real because it's the taste of a strawberry. Well, the strawberry's taste is a major part of how that berry came to evolve in this ecological dynamic over evolutionary history. So we have to bring experience back into nature from Whitehead's point of view.
You've also alluded to Hegel and the German idealists, and I know in your writings you point out that German idealism, the rich traditions of Kant and others, Hegel, who followed him, were in the wane, just as British empiricism and British idealism were developing. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the relationship between German idealism and British idealism, and how that dynamic influenced Whitehead.
Hegel dies in 1831. Schelling dies in 1854. And while the first half of the 19th century was really taken with this idealistic spirit in Germany, and it had filtered into Britain and America initially through Coleridge, who visited Germany and wanted to study with Fichte and Schelling, and couldn't afford to get to Jena where they were teaching. And so he learned with some students of theirs and brought a bunch of German books back with him to England right around 1800, late 1790s, I believe, and begins to write about this and even translate some of Schelling's work without attribution. Schelling later forgave him for that plagiarism. But we can thank Coleridge for bringing German idealism into the English language. And, Coleridge was a great poet as well, but not as great as his friend Wordsworth. But I like to think that Coleridge's greatest work of art is actually his friend Wordsworth, who he really tried to convey the spirit of this new German philosophy to, and Wordsworth put it into verse. And Whitehead has three major influences: William James, Plato, and Wordsworth. He read Wordsworth's poetry like scripture, and so there's that influence through Coleridge and Wordsworth on Whitehead from the German idealists.
Well, I was just going to add, Wordsworth is identified as one of the foremost poets of the Romantic movement, I believe. So there we have a connection between German idealism and Romanticism.
Fichte and Schelling were deeply romantic thinkers, even though Hegel articulates some early criticisms of what he calls the beautiful soul, and the whole Romantic movement for Hegel was a bit too inward focused. But it's hard from the outside not to see Hegel as also having some of this romantic spirit. Similarly, Goethe, he writes this novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was a best-selling novel across Germany and Europe. Very romantic in spirit. And then, of course, Goethe later starts to criticize his own earlier work and the whole romantic thing, returning to a more classical perspective. But still, Goethe's a romantic. I mean, come on. And so, yeah, German Romanticism, English Romanticism, and then also the influence in America on the Transcendentalists. Emerson was reading and learning German to read Goethe directly and to read Schelling directly. And so you get this rich injection of the German Romantic and German idealist perspective coming into the United States through Emerson's work and Emerson's influence in the whole Transcendentalist movement. And the British idealists, again, were approaching idealism in a way that was uniquely, British, in the sense that you can't get away from the more practical, empirically grounded approach that, whether it's a function of the structure of the English language or just a cultural difference, it brought German idealism sort of down from the heights of abstraction and, really try to describe experience and its relevance to our direct experience, I think, in a richer way, or that's more approachable for us as British and American people. And so, yeah, Whitehead's inheriting all of this and trying to make Romanticism, which so often was critical of natural science, more compatible and friendly to the scientific outlook. Right, so he wants a scientific romanticism or a romantic science, and he has a beautiful chapter in his 1925 book, Science in the Modern World, that's called The Romantic Reaction to this Enlightenment, rationalist, scientific worldview, which was erupting out of the scientific revolution. To take the poets seriously in their protest against these reductionistic views of nature, because he agrees with their protest, but he doesn't want to go as far as, Keats complaining about unweaving the rainbow and all of that, because he does think that scientific methods of analysis are valuable and can enrich our appreciation of the beauty of the natural world if put in their proper context.
One of the points that you make is that with the rise of positivism and analytical philosophy, that idealism in Britain was on the decline.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there are as many political and social and cultural reasons for that as there are purely philosophical reasons. The First World War breaks out, and there's a lot of anti-German sentiment in Britain and in America as well. If you go back and look at some of the newspaper articles and the opinions of politicians and intellectuals at the time in the English-speaking world, there was blame placed on these philosophers, including Hegel, for German nationalism and militarism, which is kind of rich coming from the British at the height of their empire, blaming the Germans for being too imperialistic. But nonetheless, there was this real anti-German spirit which swept through the English-speaking world and led to the decline not only of German idealism and appreciation for it, but British idealism as well, which was perceived to be politically dangerous and so somehow totalitarian. Whether or not that's justified, I don't particularly think it is, but there are extra philosophical reasons, and there was non-philosophical reasons that idealism declined in the 20th century, and the world wars, so transformative and in a destructive way, brought about tremendous cultural change, and I think this was one of the casualties. But idealism's coming back now, so the scene has changed a bit.
Well, we've done a dozen interviews on this channel with Bernardo Kastrup, who refers to his philosophy as analytic idealism.
Nice. Yeah, that's nice branding to split the difference there and try to bring these things together. Yeah, and he's a very rigorous thinker. I've spoken with Bernardo, and it's a very positive sign, I think, that both idealism and panpsychism are being taken more seriously now, even in the academy, as some of these problems around the place of consciousness and nature become increasingly well recognized, and the intractable approach that would want to reduce consciousness to brain activity, the intractability of that is just more apparent to people, and so they're looking again at some of these options that were brushed aside a century ago.
Well, I would like to explore with you, Matt, the relationship between all of these philosophical trends and mystical or esoteric thinking as well. It certainly runs through the the Romantics. It runs through Goethe and his influence on Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy. And I know you pick up on that in the subtitle of your book when you talk about the etheric vision and how that relates to Whitehead's philosophy.
Yeah, so, in Steiner's anthroposophy, which in many ways is inheriting this theosophical view that reality has these layers to it, and that the physical layer revealed to our normal physical senses is just the outermost shell, as it were, the husk, and that we can develop and cultivate other organs of perception that would allow us to see more deeply into the cosmic process that we are a part of. And so this, it's a, ancient account of like levels of reality, but the Theosophists had these terms of the etheric and the astral, and the spiritual, which Steiner picks up on. And I talk about the etheric dimension in one of my books as it's the life of nature. And notoriously in biology, very often if you ask a biologist, what is life? What is the essence of life? They'll give you a list of characteristics like, metabolism and reproduction and, et cetera, et cetera. But what is its essence? What is its core? They can't really tell you because it's not physical. It's an activity. It's a feeling, and it's something subtler than what can be measured by some kind of instrumentation, something subtler than what would be amenable to, counting, basically, arithmetic and geometry, which are the usual methods deployed by physics to understand the natural world. And so what do we do if we can't get our way to the essence of life by counting things or measuring things? We need to develop a new form of perception. And I think drawing on Goethe, drawing on Steiner, and indeed drawing on Whitehead, we need to really recognize that imagination, it can spiral off into fantasy and become detached from the natural world, but we can also cultivate it as a method of perceiving more deeply into the natural world and perceiving the way that the forms of plants and animals are generated through time, right? And get a sense not just for nature as it appears to us in an instant as spatially extended, but nature as it grows through a process of metamorphosis. And like Goethe, distill the formative forces that are at work, behind the scenes, but they're also apparent, again, if we can look at nature through this series of metamorphoses that it goes through. We begin to distill these formative powers. And so it takes just as much an artistic sensitivity as a scientific discipline to begin to perceive in this way. But I think it's possible, and I think it's sort of the next major leap forward in our attempt to scientifically understand the natural world and really get at life in a way that would do it justice in a non-reductionistic way.
And would I be correct in assuming that this is what you mean when you use the term descendental as opposed to transcendental?
Yes. So transcendental is a term that comes out of Immanuel Kant's philosophy, right? And so he would, in order to understand descendental, you first have to understand what I'm inverting in that turn of phrase. So for Kant, what science does is it studies phenomena. It studies the phenomenal world, and what goes on behind the scenes, as it were, we can't say. We can't know anything about that. And so for Kant, what constitutes the phenomenal world? Well, it's not really a world out there that we're receiving. For Kant, it's rather that our mind is organized in such a way and our senses are organized in such a way so as to construct this phenomenal realm for us. So we have a set of categories that Kant elaborates, and there are 12 of them. And every object that science might want to talk about presupposes these categories. And similarly, we have space and time as what he called forms of intuition. So our outer sense of space, which is where geometry comes from, and our inner sense of time, which is what allows us to count, right? Kant would say that these mathematical forms of intuition are provided by our own organization. And so what science perceives as matter moving in space and time, Kant would say has more to do with our own mental organization than it does with anything out there. Now, this was Kant's attempt to prevent kind of crass reductionism. But it has its own sort of problems, which is, one of the questions one might ask is, well, where did this mind come from? And also, we know there's a world out there, and so Kant's telling us we can't access it. And so what I try to do with this descendental inversion, and here I'm really just following in Whitehead's footsteps. He doesn't use that term, but he wants to say, look, rather than thinking of the natural world, as Kant did, as just an appearance produced by our own mind, let's reverse that and try to understand the way in which the mind itself is an expression of the natural world, is something that nature itself is involved in producing. And it was actually one of the post-Kantian idealists I mentioned earlier, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, who first elaborates this kind of inversion of Kant. So if Kant's problem was, how is it that nature can appear in the way that it does to the mind, Schelling inverts that and says, how is it that, what must nature be such that mind could have emerged from it, right? And Schelling's answer is that, well, it must have already had some mental power implicit in it. And Schelling elaborates an evolutionary picture where, in a sense, less intense mind gradually becomes more elaborated and complex over the course through a series of evolutionary stages. And Whitehead's philosophy, he does read a little bit of Schelling directly, but he gets Schelling secondhand again through Wordsworth, and he was friends with many idealists at Cambridge. And so he gets some of it secondhand, but he's basically elaborating a similar picture. And so descendental philosophy would be reversing this vector and going down into our experience and exploring the subtle textures of our bodily feeling, and in understanding the way in which feelings can be transmitted through our own nervous system. And this is right at the edges of our consciousness, right? We can't really shine the full light of our consciousness on our visceral experience, but we do have some sense of it. And Whitehead would say, in our own visceral experience, we have an analogy for causal transaction in nature writ large, so that we can understand causal connection in the natural world as though it were the transmission of feeling, right? And so we have access to the inner workings of nature because we ourselves as natural beings directly experience that. And he comes up with this term, technical term, prehension, which for him is like a non-conscious feeling. And he thinks these non-conscious feelings are connecting all of the entities in nature. And so that if you were to ask a Whiteheadian, well, what is nature made of? Well, it's made of pulses of emotion. It's made of feelings being radiated in every direction. And organisms evolve as receivers of these feelings and amplifiers of these feelings. And so our own consciousness, our own physiology is a kind of, he would say, a complex amplifier of this network of feelings that's pulsing through the natural world all around us. And so that's the inversion of this Kantian transcendental picture. You know, there's a lot more I could lay out, but hopefully that's a comprehensible picture.
It's comprehensible, and I think it's beautiful. It reminds me of an idea that I attribute to Goethe, that he talked about the Urpflanz, the archetypal image, which is the basics of a plant. And I know he's had a real influence on the science of botany with that idea. But Goethe went further. He said that the archetypes that are the basis of his poetry, and he's one of the world's greatest poets, are the same as the archetypes that are the basis of the plant.
You know, a romantic approach to science exemplified by Goethe shows that you really do need a poetic sensitivity and an artistic sensitivity to get at this etheric dimension of the natural world. And it's so unfortunate nowadays that people that go into a STEM discipline and become a specialist in some particular subdiscipline of this or that special science very often have had absolutely no exposure in their formal education to the history of philosophy, to literature and the arts. Once in a while, you get a genius scientific thinker who, because of their own interest, has explored the arts and philosophy, but it's not part of the formal training. They don't even get the history of their own science often. Much less, the history of culture and art and philosophy. And, Goethe was one of these real Renaissance men, and in a sense, so was Whitehead. One of the reasons Whitehead is so difficult to approach is that, 100 years ago, it was already so difficult to have the requisite mastery of the mathematics and the physics and the biology and the psychology and an understanding of the history of culture to really create this synoptic vision and this big picture cosmology. And now 100 years later, you couldn't possibly keep up with the advances in all of these special scientific disciplines. And the effort to integrate all of that nowadays is, it boggles the mind, right? And so how do we understand Whitehead when, like me personally, I don't have any facility in mathematics really. And so I rely on the interpretations of others to help me make sense of that aspect of his philosophy. Whereas others are very good at the math, but don't have a sense for the history of philosophy that he's trying. And so it really it's this grand inter and even transdisciplinary project that our educational system is not set up to support. So we really do have to swim upstream nowadays to be able to get the big picture back into view.
My mentor, Arthur M. Young, graduated from Princeton, as I recall, in 1925 and became acquainted with Whitehead's work shortly thereafter and wanted to be a philosopher. He wanted to develop a process philosophy building on Whitehead's work, but he felt that he wasn't qualified to do so until he could demonstrate some form of mastery over the physical world. So he went to the patent office in Washington, D.C., to find out, what were some of the problems, unsolved problems in technology that people were working on. And he came up with the idea of the helicopter, a vehicle that could hover in midair and go in any direction, up, down, right, left, back, forth. And he set out to build one, and he actually succeeded. He worked on it until 1947, when it was produced by the Bell Aircraft Corporation, the first commercially licensed helicopter, the Bell Model 47. And then he felt he was qualified to begin to work on a theory of process along the lines that Whitehead had really laid out the blueprint for.
Yeah, Arthur Young's work is very impressive for that reason. And, Whitehead wasn't an engineer, but, he studied with the student of James Clerk Maxwell, who, conceived of electromagnetic theory. And so, from very early on in his education, Whitehead was quite proficient in, this field theoretical understanding of the natural world. Right. And so he's coming out of mathematical physics in an attempt to address these metaphysical puzzles. And, very often you will get speculative philosophers trying to put science in its place without actually having gone through the initiatory experience of mastering the paradigms and the approaches that they're criticizing. And so I think Whitehead is unique among speculative philosophers, I think, in having really gone through the most rigorous mathematical training and making major contributions to mathematical logic, and actually being bold enough in 1922 to meet with Einstein and offer some criticisms of Einstein's interpretation of relativity. Whitehead accepts the general picture of relativistic spacetime, but has some very important philosophical criticisms for Einstein, elaborated in his 1922 book, Principle of Relativity. And Einstein says he didn't understand Whitehead. So fair enough, he's in good company. If Einstein can't even understand Whitehead, then...
Until I encountered your work, Whitehead was just beyond me. It seemed as if he was speaking, it was English all right, but it was a language I could barely understand at all. So you've done a fabulous job of not only clarifying Whitehead for me, Matt, but making me realize how crucial his philosophy is today as a parapsychologist for beginning to make sense of the data that our field encounters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a point towards the end of Process and Reality where he actually mentions telepathy and says that, look, if this account that I'm calling Descendental, where we're embedded in this network of feelings, right? If this is a true account of reality, then actually telepathy is going on all the time. We're just not conscious of it. And so when these experiences that for most of us are somewhat abnormal and out of the ordinary, when they do occur, we're just becoming conscious of something that's actually foundational. And parapsychology, in that sense, in a Whiteheadian cosmology, is just psychology. It doesn't need to be para anymore. It's quite normal and to be expected, right? And so it really does reconfigure the way in which what nowadays are mostly considered to be anomalous phenomena are actually giving us insight into the very basis of reality. And so we need to look more closely at these anomalies because they're revealing to us something important that our normal consciousness screens out.
Well, you've used the term the etheric world, an etheric vision, I believe. do you think that that term that seems to come out of theosophy and anthroposophy can be integrated into a modern philosophy of science?
It might need to be a post or meta-modern philosophy of science, but because it's still ahead of us. I think it would require a totally different approach to science education, as I've been hinting at. And there are some signs that we're moving in that direction, and other signs that it's slow going. Like this wonderful school that I was a student at and then taught at, Schumacher College, which has this programs teaching. It's in the UK, in Devonshire, Totnes, outside of Totnes, and they were teaching a Goethean approach to natural science, and it just closed. So that's not a good sign. And one of their key teachers, the biologist Stephen Harding, he just passed away last week. He was friends of James Lovelock and a proponent of the Gaia theory, and so it's sad to see that particular little node that was trying to water and cultivate this new approach to science has gone by the wayside. But there's plenty of other places around the world where this type of work is going on, but it's an uphill battle, because this approach to science doesn't have that same degree of industrial application and technological payoff, and it's not going to allow us to master and control nature. But as it turns out, in light of the ecological crisis doesn't even quite capture it, catastrophe that's underway right now, maybe there are some reasons to second guess whether this technological approach to the mastery of nature really leads us in a direction of greater control, or actually just unleashes chaos, because we're dealing with a system far more complex than what our mechanistic models might lead us to believe. And so one of the reasons people are looking again at this more organic approach to science, and looking again at the ways in which things, certain aspects of nature can't be measured, but might be approachable aesthetically, and by the cultivation of our own human sensory experience and our human imagination, we can begin to perceive these connections in nature that are too subtle to measure in a quantitative way. And that, these aesthetic values, like Whitehead goes to great lengths in his book Science in the Modern World to talk about the disaster that resulted from not thinking of aesthetic values as being inherent in the natural world, so that we build things without any consideration for the beauty that's disturbed and the way in which beauty has an ecological function, right? And so I would hope that, as this materialist, technologically oriented understanding of the natural world begins to dawn on people, that this might be part of the source of a lot of our ecological troubles, that we'll look again at these alternative approaches before it's too late. But it's a whole shift in the values of our civilization. It's more than just a new approach to science. It goes much, much deeper than that, having to do with how our economy is structured and what we might mean by progress. Like, is progress just growing the GDP, or is it enriching human life and human flourishing at a qualitative level? So it's a big change, and it might take a century before we can notice any real progress there.
Well, Matt Segall, this has been a very rewarding conversation. I want to thank you so much for sharing the depth of your understanding and the breadth of your understanding as well with me and with the New Thinking Aloud audience. Thank you for being with me. And I have to say, I'm very intrigued by your work. I hope we can have more conversations in the future.
Yeah, no, I'd love that, Jeff. I've been watching Thinking Aloud for many years, and I'm so glad that New Thinking Aloud is continuing. You do great work, wonderful conversations to bring these ideas out into the world. So yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Thank you. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.